So last week, Reza Pahlavi, the son of the late Shah of Iran, gave a speech at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and he basically called on the U.S. again to support the Iranian people in overthrowing the Islamic Republic and replacing it with a secular democracy in Iran. And as often happens with uh, uh, opposition leaders, in particular from the Middle East, who are in exile and advocating for democratic reform in their countries, these they tend to be derided and dismissed, but because they're compared to Ahmed Chalabi, and usually these comparisons are not really comparisons. They're accusations. They're made in an attempt to discredit these people and basically suggest that they're sleazy, that they can't be trusted, etc. And the assumption, of course, is that there's an unstated point here that, because they're like Ahmed Chalabi, they must be a problem for U.S. policy. Now, I've spent a lot of time studying Ahmed Chalabi, researching him. I never got to meet him, unfortunately, but we did have a number of mutual friends. And so I want to take this opportunity to explain and tell what I think the real story is with Ahmed Chalabi, what his significance was, what his role was as an Iraqi in opposition, what his role was, and how U.S. policy unfolded. And then against that backdrop, talk about whether or not these comparisons between Ahmed Chalabi and Reza Pahlavi are in fact appropriate. So I think before we get into who Ahmed Chalabi is and why he's important, I think it's worthwhile to give some historical perspective here. So basically the origins of how Chalabi came to the fore, I think really go back to April 1988. At that time, the Jalal Talabani, which is obviously a name you might recognize if you've been following Iraq. At the time, Jalal Talabani was the leader of one of the Kurdish parties in Kurdistan, and he came to the U.S. for the first time. And unlike today, where obviously the Kurds are quite well known in Washington, at that time, very few people really knew who these Kurds were in the Iraqi parts of Iraq. And basically what happened is that Jalal Talabani came to Washington and he tried to set up some meetings with different low-level people in the Senate and the State Department. And within a few days of these meetings with Talabani, Turkey complained to Washington directly to George Shultz, saying that the U.S. should not be meeting with, quote, Kurdish terrorists. This is what they called them. Obviously, because Turkey was at the time, as they are today, worried about their own Kurdish separatist problem. And then around the same time, Saddam Hussein's regime also complained to the U.S., saying that the U.S. should not be meeting with these Kurdish leaders. And if you'll remember at the time, in April 1988, the Iran-Iraq war is winding down. The U.S. obviously had a complicated relationship with Iraq during the Iran-Iraq war. And there were hopes that in the aftermath of the Iran-Iraq war, the U.S. and Iraq might reach some kind of a rapprochement. So U.S. policymakers at the time basically said, okay, fine, Turkey's a NATO ally. We have this agenda with Iraq. We want to try to bring them into our fold. So we're not going to irritate and aggravate the situation by meeting with these Iraqi opposition leaders. Now, obviously, things between the U.S. and Iraq became complicated and ultimately broke out into war in the early 90s and the Gulf War. But the remarkable thing about it was that even though the U.S. had gone to war against Iraq, this policy about not making contact, at least formal diplomatic contact, with the Iraqi opposition remained intact. And what ended up happening basically was that Bernard Lewis, at the time a professor at Princeton, he had happened to meet with a group of Iraqis who were watching the Gulf War unfold. They were recognizing, obviously, that the Saddam Hussein regime was on the brink of collapse. They recognized that it was vulnerable, and they began to get organized and think about what Iraq might look like in the aftermath of Saddam. So Bernard Lewis basically tried to facilitate a meeting between these, what he called smart Iraqis. These were Iraqis out of the country who were going up against Saddam. And one of the Iraqis who he met and got to know was Ahmed Chalabi. Now, Ahmed Chalabi was a banker and a mathematician. He was a scion of a prominent Shia family from Baghdad, who had been prominent in Iraq for a long time. And if you want to learn more about the history of the Chalabi family, I would recommend a book by Tamara Chalabi, Ahmed's daughter, called Late for Tea at the Deer Palace. It's a really remarkable book, and Tamara's a Harvard-trained historian, so it's a professional book and very well written. Anyway, and so so Chalabi has this family background. He was also a graduate from MIT, and then he went on to pursue a PhD in math from the University of Chicago. So just an extraordinarily bright guy. And then he, basically he wasn't able to return to Iraq. So he taught at the math at the American University of Beirut. Then he moved to Jordan. He founded a bank there. And after a dispute with the Jordanian government, and the details of that remain a little bit murky, he basically fled to London, and he began to become active, trying to organize Iraqi exiles against Saddam Hussein. And then during the uprising against Saddam in 1991, Chalabi began to write op-eds in U.S. papers, basically outlining a strategy for how the U.S. could help the Iraqi opposition and bring democracy to Iraq. Now, Chalabi was trying to get a meeting here in the George H.W. Bush administration, and there was a group of people at the Pentagon who wanted to meet with him, but when they tried to meet with him, they realized that they still were not permitted to. There remained this ban in place. Now, why was that? What you saw here was really the beginning of a debate within the American government that would become, right from the early 90s, right up through the time the U.S. ultimately invaded Iraq, a very divisive, long-standing debate. And what it basically had to do with was whether or not, what kind of an Iraq the U.S. wanted after the Gulf War. So, contrary to what people believe, this idea of this American policy of regime change actually did not begin in 1993. I would argue it really began toward the end of the Gulf War, when George H.W. Bush authorized intelligence efforts to try to take out Saddam. So there were covert operations happening with the idea of removing Saddam. The problem was that there was a debate about what kind of an Iraq we wanted after removing Saddam. So the vision that Ahmed Chalabi was advocating, and he had support, as we'll talk about, was that he really wanted Iraq to emerge as a democracy. And one of the implications of Iraq becoming a democracy not only would be that the authoritarian system of government would change to something based more on the rule of law, but also it would mean, because of a new majoritarian system, that Iraq's ruling Sunni elite, who had been in power for a long time, would probably lose power to a Shia majority. And Ahmed Chalabi was a Shia. And this was a prospect that was very concerning to most of the American government, particularly in the State Department and also the CIA. Their thinking basically was that Iran, as long as it was under Sunni control, served as a useful counterweight to Shia Iran, and also that they had the U.S. had by this time established good relations with other Sunni regimes in the Middle East, the Saudis, Egyptians, etc., all of whom obviously preferred to have a Sunni in Iraq rather than a Shia. So there's a tension here. So basically what the CIA, State Department, I would say the prevailing view in the American government, one that I think the most of the George H.W. Bush administration shared, was that Saddam Hussein himself was a problem. But all things considered, the U.S. would probably be better off with the stability and familiarity of a government in Iraq that remained Sunni, and if it were a dictatorship, so be it. Now, this was obviously aggravating to Chalabi, and so what he basically did was he began to do two things. One was he began to try to unify the Iraqi opposition, which at that time was very scattered, very weak, not all that coherent of a force. And what he tried to do was basically create an umbrella organization that would bring together different facets of the Iraqi opposition: the Kurds, Shia, exiles, a lot of Sunni dissidents. It's worth mentioning. At the time, especially during the height of the insurrection in 1991, a number of people defected from the Iraqi regime, and they were also natural people to try to recruit into a opposition movement. And so what Chalabi basically did was he created a new organization, and he called it the Iraqi National Congress, which was a name inspired by the Indian National Congress and the African National Congress. These were the respective independence movements that ultimately prevailed in India and South Africa. And he organized a series of conferences that basically brought together many different factions of the Iraqi opposition. And he ultimately, by October 1992, was also able to bring into the fold the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iraq, SIRI, and also the Islamic Dawah Party, both of whom would become very prominent after 2003. The other thing they did was that they offered a vision and a set of strategies and policies on how to bring about regime change in Iraq. And what they were arguing is that, look, what the U.S. is aiming for, what was at the time called the, quote, one bullet solution, which was the idea that basically someone in the Ba'ath Party, some senior general, would take out Saddam and his immediate family, this sort of gang from Tikriti, and that they would then bring in a new government. But Chalabi was basically saying, look, they're aiming for what he called Saddam Light. So what Chalabi proposed and said was regime change that would happen along two tracks. So the first was a political track, and what Chalabi was basically saying is that, you know, we need to do two things here. We need to begin to, one, hold Saddam and his regime accountable for his war crimes and his human rights record, and he thought that could happen by pushing for Saddam's prosecution in an international tribunal. And then the other thing was to begin to organize and recognize a government in exile that would be recognized as a legitimate government in Iraq. So he wanted to organize a government in exile, and then in order to create more legitimacy for this government of Iraq, he thought that basically there were these major pockets of Iraq that could be liberated from Saddam's regime. And this already had basically come to fruition in the Kurdish north, where the U.S. had set up a no-fly zone, and basically was now creating, in a way, a de facto autonomous region. And Chalabi believed that some sort of a safe haven could also be created in the Shia part of Iraq. Now, Chalabi also thought that once you get these enclaves, both in the north and the south, ready, what you could then do at that time was arm the insurgents who had already shown a willingness to take on the regime in the 91 uprising, and that these insurgents could basically, as became later known as the ink blot strategy, they could slowly advance toward Baghdad, take over more and more parts of Iraq, begin to consolidate control, and ultimately take over the country. Now, if this idea sounds a little bit crazy or eccentric, one of the things to realize was that there was, throughout the 90s, this model did work to some degree in Bosnia, where there was a big debate in the American government over whether or not to arm the Bosnian rebels when they were under attack from the Serbs. The U.S. ultimately ended up doing it after Bosnians were getting slaughtered, and things basically turned out okay. It's also worth remembering, too, that this is effectively a variant of an idea of how the U.S. conducted the initial phase of the invasion in Afghanistan in 2001, where there were these guys in the Northern Alliance and also less organized Pashtun tribes and so forth. The U.S. basically armed them, provided air cover, and they ended up taking over Kabul, if you remember. Now, what happened here? I mean, basically, what ended up happening was that Chalabi realized over the course of the 90s that he wasn't going to get anywhere with the CIA and with the State Department, and things particularly soured in 1995 when basically there was a failed insurrection against Saddam, and Chalabi blamed the CIA for incompetence. The CIA blamed Chalabi for coordinating the insurrection without. So things got things became problematic. So what Chalabi did was that he recognized, look, I'm not getting anywhere with the permanent bureaucracy in Washington. The Clinton administration had a not exactly favorable view of Chalabi. They kind of wanted to wash their hands of the Iraq problem. So Chalabi went directly to the American Congress, and he waged a very savvy, sophisticated lobbying operation, PR operation, and ultimately organized and galvanized enough support, bipartisan support, to get Congress to pass the Iraq Liberation. This was in the late 90s, and basically it declared now that the official policy of the American government toward Iraq is that we want a democratic Iraq, we want regime change. And they authorized a bunch of money to be distributed to the Iraqi opposition to work toward the overthrow of Saddam. And then the Clinton administration signed it into law, but kind of implemented it haphazardly. So that by the late 90s now, we're in this situation where the Iraq is under this very tough sanctions regime. The Kurds are becoming more and more autonomous, but efforts to overthrow Iraq with a coup or through other means are basically not working. But at the same time, the CIA and the State Department continue to believe that even though they're not happy with Saddam, that they also continue to doubt the wisdom of having a democratic government in Iraq. One, because of this Shia issue, but also they just worry about general instability in Iraq. Now, this debate, which is lingering and so forth, really becomes a live issue after 9/11, when it looks like, one, there's a general recognition in the U.S. that I would say that there are basically three big things that are happening. One is obviously just an awareness of this challenge emanating from the Middle East. Secondly, there's a newfound appreciation of what the costs are of having authoritarian government in the Middle East, and people are beginning to wonder whether 9/11 and other problems emanating from the Middle East are a consequence of a democracy deficit in the Middle East. And then third, there's heightened sensitivity to the threat posed by Iraq. particularly due to the WMD issue, which at the time, the prevailing wisdom was that Iraq should have some kind of a WMD capability that could be a problem. So as the U.S. decides to make, the Bush administration moves toward making Iraq a priority and trying to confront the Saddam problem once and for all, this issue of what to do in the aftermath becomes a live issue. And I think one of the big sort of mistakes or big errors or big misperceptions that even today remain out there is the fact that the Bush administration did not think about what comes after Iraq. In fact, it's not true. What ended up happening was actually throughout the interagency process, right from the very early days of the Bush administration, there was a vigorous, latent, ongoing debate about what happens after Iraq. The problem was that not that there wasn't any discussion, but that there was no agreement within the Bush administration on what happens after Iraq. And a big part of it has to do with many of the issues that Ahmed Chalabi raised beginning in the early 90s, which is, what do you do after Saddam's gone? Do you want a Sunni government, or do you want to roll the dice with the Shia? And then, it became clear at a certain point that simply installing another dictator wasn't going to cut it if the U.S. is going to invade militarily. But the question remains, how do you actually make this transition happen? And one of the concerns from many parts of the State Department and the CIA was that if you do empower these Iraqi exiles, if you do really make a bet on a Shia-led democracy, not only are there these geopolitical concerns that have been raised, but now they have this personal animus against Ahmed Chalabi, and there's a recognition that Chalabi is by far the leader, by far the savviest guy in the Iraqi opposition, and it's possible that he could swoop in and take power and become a leader in Iraq. And there were a lot of people believed that Chalabi could emerge as the leader of Iraq the way Charles de Gaulle had emerged in France after World War II, or with more recent memory, with the way Hamid Karzai had emerged from exile, being relatively unknown to being the leader of Iraq. And this debate just persisted. It never got resolved. And ultimately, what ended up happening was that the U.S. ended up basically alienating Chalabi when they decided to ultimately install not an Iraqi, full sovereign Iraqi government, but they put Paul Bremer in charge of an American occupation, just an American-controlled government in Iraq, beginning in 2003. And so, and so Chalabi is obviously now upset, and the U.S. government, ties between the U.S. and Chalabi begin to fracture. Then when the U.S. realizes that there are no WMD in Iraq and a major rationale for the war begins to fall apart, then people begin to blame Chalabi and his organization for feeding faulty intelligence to the U.S. And that's a whole another sort of a line of inquiry there that we could talk about whether or not Chalabi in fact did feed correct or incorrect information. Then there were accusations that Chalabi was a agent of Iran, which is a whole other complicated issue. He did have ties to Iran, but was he an agent of Iran? There remain debates about that. But so basically now, with all of this happening, Chalabi has now emerged as this sort of all-purpose bogeyman, this character who just epitomizes what a shady Middle Eastern guy in exile is, that basically is trying to pursue his own agenda and get the U.S. to do his bidding by overthrowing governments in the Middle East and creating their problems. Now, as I think I've suggested in this narrative, the truth is considerably more complicated. Chalabi had his issues, but I think he's not the villain. I would argue that the way he's typically portrayed. Now this brings us to the question. So Reza Pahlavi is arguing he's in exile. He lives actually nearby Washington. He's been in the U.S. for a long time. He's an American-educated guy. He also is agitating, trying to organize the Iranian opposition, trying to become a leader of the Iranian opposition, and also calling on the U.S. to try to adopt a policy of regime change. And does he have ambitions in a new Iran? Who knows? I mean, probably, right? Now, here's where I think there are similarities and differences. Now, I think Pahlavi and Chalabi do have a couple of similarities. I think one is that they both come from distinguished families who have some sort of a claim on power in Iraq. I think the second big similarity they have is that they're exiles, that they haven't been in the country for a long time. And so it remains unclear the degree to which they really have influence in the country. That's sort of an unknown with them. The third is basically what they're calling for as an end goal, which is that they're calling for regime change in their country and replacement with a sovereign, liberal, democratic government. This is what they're arguing for. This is what they want. And that they're making this argument in the face of a highly skeptical permanent American bureaucracy. I think while Pahlavi does not have the same enmity in the American government that Chalabi did, I think it's fair to say that the vast majority of officials, particularly in the permanent bureaucracy, do not regard Pahlavi in a favorable light necessarily. Now, where are their differences though? And I think that there are two big differences here. The first is that Chalabi and Pahlavi are very different people as individuals. I mean, Ahmed Chalabi was just a really extraordinarily intelligent individual, very hard-charging. He could be abrasive, but just highly competent, very sophisticated. And my own view is that a big part of why Chalabi provoked so much resentment, I would argue, is a certain latent racism in American society, that there was something about this foreigner, this Arab American, who could play the American game, the American system better than many Americans could. And I think that provoked lasting resentment. Pahlavi, personally, from what I can tell, I haven't met him personally, but he does not seem to be as much of a, I think, an intellectual, as much of a savvy operator. He seems to be a little bit less organized, but at the same time, he's not as abrasive of a guy. He doesn't like rub people the wrong way in the same way as Chalabi. So I think their temperament is different. But I think that the bigger difference here, and here I think here's where I think the parallel falls apart. I would argue that if I were to take issue with, at least with the benefit of hindsight, with what Chalabi was arguing, that I think although he was advocating a whole set of political policy recommendations that were basically not heeded, I do think that Chalabi ultimately believed that the solution to getting rid of Saddam in one form or the other did involve a military solution. Now, initially he favored more of an insurgency, but eventually he did come to basically favor a US-led military intervention in Iraq. And I think he assumed, like many people assumed, that a US military invasion, while not ideal, was ultimately necessary and in a prudent, appropriate way to deal with this Iraq problem. Pahlavi has been very consistent on this point, that he has, as far as I know, he has not called for a military solution in Iran, and he certainly is not calling for one today. And you can see that. I read his 2001 book. The title is Winds of Change, The Future of Democracy in Iran. And Pahlavi envisions something that I talked about in my last video, which is really a revolution in Iran happening through a nonviolent resistance, through a genuine, broad-based democratic movement that would not be resorting to force, but rather would be engaging in a nonviolent revolution against the regime, and he appears to have really studied this. I don't think he is just saying this. I think he does have an acute awareness of what strategies and tactics of nonviolent conflict are. He talks about them in his book. He has talked about it consistently in his speeches, writing, statements, and you know, although I don't know Pahlavi, we do have a number of mutual friends who are genuine believers in democracy in Iran, have really thought about how to achieve this, and they think Pahlavi is the real deal. They think that while he may not be the most effective operator, that he does legitimately believe in a nonviolent solution to regime change in Iran. So, you know, my own view here, the takeaway here, one, that these glib comparisons to Chalabi, I think, are at a very minimum simplistic and unhelpful, but I would argue too that they do not do justice to who Ahmed Chalabi was. He was a flawed individual. He did make a lot of strategic misjudgments, but he's certainly not the villain that I think he's been portrayed to be. I think more than anything, he's a scapegoat for errors that have really nothing to do with the Iraqi opposition and have much more to do with the missteps and miscalculations of American and Western leaders. And my second point here is that I think, like Chalabi, who, I mean, look, I think at the end of the day, given how badly things have gone in Iraq, I think the question has to be asked, was there a counterfactual where we did what Chalabi was advocating, where we really pushed this political angle, where we armed the Iraqi opposition? And yes, you know, maybe had we given Chalabi a chance, just given him a chance to come into the country and emerge as a leader in Iraq, build his legitimacy just like other exiles did, could there have been a better path? And I have to think that Chalabi would have enjoyed more legitimacy in Iraq than Paul Bremer did, than an American occupation did in Iraq. But the second point here is that, you know, like that I think Pahlavi here has a vision for a democratic Iran. I think it deserves to be taken seriously. I think throwing our weight, or at least giving an opportunity or taking seriously Pahlavi and people in the Iranian opposition, is a wise bet, not only because it might offer a path to getting to a democratic Iran, but given what we know about Iran's record on terrorism, on human rights, on WMD, just like we didn't anticipate what happened with 9/11, there could very well be another geopolitical disaster where the Iran problem really comes to the fore, and where there is a recognition from a future American government that we have to do regime change. And at that juncture, if we don't invest in an opposition in exile right now, we may be left in a position where we don't really know what we're doing. We don't know who we're working with. We don't really have a coherent plan for the aftermath. And I think that Pahlavi has shown a great deal of wisdom and maturity in recognizing that there is a path here that does not involve military intervention, and that there are ways, using strategies and tactics of nonviolent revolution, where with a little bit of a nudge and support and recognition from the US, that we may be able to get to a free democratic Iran.